Welcome to Network Design Methodologies, the top-down approach and design life cycles. When you're finding yourself in the position of being responsible for designing either a change to the network or a brand new network, or even a total redesign to an existing network, it helps to have a repeatable approach to the situation. That way, when your boss says, we need a total redesign because we're implementing voice over IP, you're not just like, where do I start? You'll know exactly where to start and what questions you should ask to start your design process. So, top down versus bottom up. What do they mean here? I like to think of this in terms of the OSI model, right? So you've got your application layer at the top and going down to the physical layer at the bottom. With bottom up, you're shooting from the hip. Then that VoIP scenario, some people are like, so I know I'll need some power over Ethernet switches and a new router for voice traffic, and they'll go ahead and start buying up all this hardware. They might even have some of that hardware already handy. They might not even know that their existing switches are actually capable of of power over Ethernet. But they're usually relying on past experience, so they know the general idea of what's needed, and they end up over-provisioning by a lot, right? To make sure everything actually works, since they're not taking the extra time needed to go through the top-down process. This does allow for a much faster design time, but it's not taking into account your future needs and goals as a company. So a couple of years, heck, even a handful of months down the road, you might be stuck doing a whole redesign again, because the current one you just implemented can't handle the growth. With top-down, we're going the other way, right? Here, we start with the application layer and work our way down. So we're starting with the application's requirements and what we'll actually use, and then work our way into finding out what hardware is most appropriate. Perhaps you're using several phones that are all video capable and they end up drawing more power, that you end up needing. It's cheaper to get higher throughput or higher electrical availability, higher PoE capability switches. Few of those rather than a bunch of just PoE 3550s and throw them all in there, but you can only use a quarter of the ports because you've maxed out on your electrical capability, that they can only give you 75 watts. Or perhaps you're doing a bunch of video conferencing all the time, and that you actually need a very significant amount of bandwidth available. Then you might end up kicking yourself if you just didn't provision for this, if you didn't get your 10 gig SFP ports to go ahead and get your access to distribution connection there, or your distribution to core. But some of the questions you might ask yourself to answer are, how much bandwidth is needed at peak usage, and what's our expected growth over the next 6 months, 18 months, 3 years? Sure, this requires a lot more work and usually much more time to complete, but you'll get it all back. Trust me. Even if just in the time you'll save troubleshooting issues later because you took the time to plan out your design and end up with a design that meets the company's needs, is scalable, and more future-proof. And this next one is what you can sell the company on when they gasp that it'll take you 3 weeks to make the design, is that overall it has a reduced total cost of ownership due to being properly scoped and requires minimal changes to scale with the company. I know we've all been there and tried to be the hero. How do you become a hero as a network engineer? You come in under budget and finish early. Sure, You might get something that works great for a month or even a couple of months, but eventually you'll be kicking yourself that you didn't put the time in to design the network properly and end up having more downtime than you even needed originally to correct the situation. So, top down, not bottom up. Though you should be aware of both, because Cisco always loves to ask a question to make sure you understand the difference. And just some of the main points here is that in your bottom up, you draw from your previous experience to get it done much faster, but that you don't consider the future needs or goals of the company. And that with top down, you start with the organizational goals and requirements, and that it's scalable and able to handle your future workload, and that overall, you will have a reduced total cost of ownership. Now, Cisco has developed two different design life cycles. First was Papadio, an acronym typically spelled rather than said. PPDIOO formalizes the steps involved with designing and operating and eventually optimizing the network. This consists of the prepare phase, where you determine organizational goals and constraints and create your high-level design. The plan phase, where you audit current network and perform a gap analysis and determine the technical requirements of the design. The design phase, where your bill of materials and low-level design are created using your information gathered in the prepare and plan phases. The implementation phase. This is where you create a pilot or prototype before you actually roll it out into production to make sure that your design works as intended. And your network implementation plan is also created here to facilitate that implementation. And your operate phase. This is your longest phase. This includes the day-to-day operations, monitoring, and troubleshooting of your network. And then the optimize phase. This is your proactive management to resolve problems before they become problems. I mean, you can see how this would work in a cycle, right? That, after you roll out your design and you're operating it, you hand it over to the NOC or what have you, or you're just yourself actually going through the monitoring and troubleshooting day to day, that you find through your monitoring that there are places where you could optimize your network. So then you prepare the design for that optimization, you plan out that design. You go ahead and actually create your low-level design and the bill of materials if you actually need to add any network equipment into your existing production network. And then you go ahead and implement that optimized design, and you operate it, and then you monitor to look for other places where you can optimize. Now, this is fine and all, but other than the obvious benefit of feeling a little more organized, what's the point? Well, Cisco's pretty specific and lists 4 key benefits that you will reap by using the PPDIOO lifecycle. These are improved business agility, increased network availability, faster access to applications and services, and a lower total cost of ownership. Now, Cisco recognized this life cycle is not overly appealing. I mean, Papadio, it's great, it's nice, but there wasn't a whole lot of participation and not a lot of people utilized it. So to increase that, they went ahead and created another design life cycle, which was really just a tweak here. When it comes to certification, though, I would certainly know the PPDIOO phases and what happens during each phase, as well as the 4 key benefits associated with using the life cycle. And at the bottom here, you see that the 6 phases, prepare, plan, design, implement, operate, optimize, that they all fit neatly into 3 more generic sections of plan, build, and manage. Plan, build, manage. This might feel like an oversimplification of the design process, but each of these phases also has several processes within them. You can certainly see, I'm sure, how the processes align closely with the PPD-IOO counterpart. I really feel Cisco did a great job with developing this lifecycle. I know I'm not actually receiving any kickback from Cisco for any of this, but it just feels more intuitive and like something that's simple enough to follow, but with enough detail to give you a strong sense of structure. When the company has a goal they want to realize, first you plan out the design, then you build the changes into the network, and you manage those changes where you're monitoring for optimization, for where to plan out possible optimization changes, build them, then manage, so on and so forth. It really is a never-ending cycle. That ensures we have a clear framework to formalize the steps needed to implement changes based on the needs of the business. As far as the exam goes, I would certainly commit the processes and phases of both plan, build, manage, and PPD-IOO to memory. This would include all these sub-processes where inside of the plan phase, we have our strategy and analysis, our network assessment, our actual design process. Then inside our build phase, we have our validation of our design. And this is where you would create your pilot and prototype networks to validate your design. You have the actual production deployment of your design and the migration. So typically you might deploy your new network equipment, but you might not actually migrate users over to it until this later process. And then in your manage phase, you have your product support and solution support. It is important to know the difference between these. Product support is individual product support. This is for your individual switches and routers and firewalls. Now your solution support, though, this is where you have your NOC. This is actually the troubleshooting of problems that might occur within your network as a whole. And then your optimization. Of course, this is where you optimize or look for optimization opportunities within your network. And then the operations management, as you can imagine, is just the management of operations of your NOC operations and how to go ahead and handle that. So that does it for this section. Now let's go ahead and do a couple of practice questions here, and then we'll move right on. Now, during which phase of the PPD-IOO model would you conduct interviews with supporting staff to develop and propose a viable solution? Now, as you can imagine, this of course happens, at least somewhere within your first three sections. That this is happening where you develop and propose a viable solution. So it has to be either in a design, plan, or prepare phase. Now, if you recall, the design phase is where your bill of materials and low-level design is created. Now, this is happening after you've already developed your viable solution. That's actually when that happens. That you aren't conducting interviews during that time to try and be able to do that. You've already done that. Now, in the plan phase, this is where it gets a little hairy. Is that your high-level design is created here. That actually, for when you would conduct interviews to perform your gap analysis and get a sense of what actually needs to be done from the high-level management at the company, this is during your prepare phase. Okay, now let's move on to the next one here. Now, in which two design processes are included in the build phase of the plan, build, manage Cisco design lifecycle? Now, you might recall the plan, build, manage had several processes within the individual sections. And this is asking about the build phase specifically. So I'll give you a few moments, and then let's go ahead and bring up that wheel here. So we can see that we've got the validation process, the deployment process, and migration process inside of our build phase. So then this would end up being A, C, that strategy and analysis is not here in the build phase. Design is not in the build phase. Assessment is not in the build phase. And product support is not in the build phase. Then our last question here. According to Cisco, which 4 improvements are the main benefits of the PPD-IOO lifecycle approach to network design? You may recall that there were 4 key benefits that Cisco is very clear about that you will reap when you utilize this lifecycle. Those benefits are improved business agility, increased network availability, and faster access to applications and services, and lower total cost of ownership. I hope this has been informative for you, and I would like to thank you for viewing.